Welcome to the autumn meeting of the Derbyshire Groundsmans Association, which took place on November 12th, and, for the first time, was a virtual meeting via Zoom. Julian Morris of the Grounds Management Association talks to us about autumn and winter maintenance and answers questions from members.
I said when I set this up, if we get 15 people on here, I should be quite pleased. So we're at 23 at the moment, so that's great. And thank you all for taking time. I hope we can have a good evening out of this. The first thing I wanted to do was to ask Mick Glenn just to say a few words, because he's got one or two like parish notices from the Cricket Board, or the Cricket Foundation as it's now called, in terms of things like grants and those sort of things. So I've given him 2 or 3 minutes at the start before we get Julian, and it's basically also allowing people to come in as well, so they won't miss too much of Julian's talk.
Yeah, okay. Well, just a couple of quick things, really, Keith. Groundsman, I'm very aware that it's been a pretty tough year for clubs, and I know that. And the ECB have recognised this to a certain degree because they've actually put some money into a grant fund called Return to Cricket Grant. And one of the things that they've identified for the first time in a long time is the end of season ground maintenance, because there was, or next season's maintenance or winter maintenance. And there was some concern from the ECB that funding might be an issue for clubs. So if there's any clubs out there that haven't applied, that think they're short of money, that have got a shortfall into their club, please ask your club to contact me about Return to Cricket Grant. And I know there's 1 or 2 clubs on this call that have already done that, and some are being processed, and 1 or 2 have already had support funding. But it's been pretty specific from the ECB to me, is that, you know, we shouldn't have clubs struggling to do end of season ground maintenance or preparation for next season through a lack of funds. So that's my main message. The second thing is, we did ask clubs, we sent out we called it, I think, a workforce survey, but essentially it was around, these are the courses that we can offer at the moment. And there were 2. There was one was an online course through the Ground Management Association, which Julian might touch on shortly and tell us a little bit about it. And the other was, spoke to Steve and Keith about running a pre-season workshop, a spring workshop. So we've spoke to Steve Hollis. So I think we're all on board with trying to get that running if we possibly can. So they were the 2 main things. I think we've got to come up for a date with that, haven't we? And then we'll send out further information. And I guess the other thing is, which probably you'll come to, Keith, is perhaps have a conversation about what we're going to do about things like AGMs, you know, and future meetings if we need them. And that's it from me, really.
Right, so good evening, everybody. Thanks for inviting me again. I think I've spoken to you at the last couple of AGMs that you've had. For those of you that haven't met me before, I'm Julian Morris, the Regional Pitch Advisor for the East Midlands region for the Grounds Management Association, formerly the Institute of Groundsmanship. So I thought this evening, rather than sort of cover old ground or sort of go into too much detail on a broad range of topics, that we'd sort of really focus on 4 kind of the key areas that we're going to be looking at during what I'd call kind of close season where cricket's concerned. So I thought we'd look at aeration or deep spiking and look at kind of the reasons behind that, what some of the benefits are, the best timings, the best methods. Everyone's favourite topic up after that is worm control, and what we can do to control and what we can do to try and reduce activity, but then deal with it when it comes. And then I'm going to touch briefly on some of the main autumn and winter diseases that we might want to look out for. And then finally, we're going to look at sort of fertilization and some of the benefits of doing that at this time of year and what that can bring to us from a cricket perspective. And then we've got some really good questions that have come in that I will cover first. I think some of it will hopefully be ticked off as I go. But as I say, give us a wave or interject if you've got any questions as I go. So I'll start off with aeration, and I think it's the same as anything really that we're doing to our ground, and it's certainly the first question that I'd ask myself when we're doing whether it be a square renovation or works to the outfield or even standard maintenance during the season, is kind of what am I trying to achieve by doing this task. In a lot of situations with deep spiking, it's one of those things that's kind of routinely carried out sort of November, December time as part of our practices. But I think it's really kind of important to understand what we're trying to achieve when we do that. One of the reasons might be to improve the bounce and carry of a pitch. So if we've got particularly issues with root breaks that can occur through over-rolling or changing of loams over the years, deep spiking can be one of the really effective ways to try and pin the soil profile together by getting those roots to develop beyond where those layerings or root breaks might occur. So that's kind of one of the really good reasons that we look to do deep spiking. Another one's to try and encourage uniform moisture throughout the profile. So obviously one of the important things that we're doing in the playing season is to try and dry out our pitch consistently, so we get a consistent drying out process and consistent moisture throughout the profile. And one of the other things as well is if we've had a season where we've perhaps not done as thorough a renovation as we would like, and we identify that there's still some old thatch layers in there, deep spiking could be a good way over time of working away at those layers where perhaps they're buried and we can't do a huge amount about them through scarification, but over the period of time aeration will help that. So what does it do? Improve water movement and consistency throughout the profile, a deeper and denser root structure. So generally speaking, grounds that haven't deep spiked previously will see an improvement in pace and bounce and carry in the season after they've done deep spiking for the first time. It reduces the risk of winter disease, so as I'll come on to, most diseases occur through humidity and moisture in the top at this time of year. So again, deep spiking can help to get the water away from the surface and reduce the risk of disease. And again, it does help to break down any organic material that hasn't kind of been addressed through scarification. I think the real important thing with deep spiking where cricket is concerned is to kind of understand the do's and the don'ts and some of the pitfalls. One of the biggest ones is spiking to too shallow a depth. So a lot of you are probably quite familiar with the sort of pedestrian groundsman spikers that have historically been used quite regularly. But one of the things I always kind of emphasise with the use of those is to make sure that the tines are relatively new and not too short, because ideally when we're deep spiking we want to be trying to do that to about 4 inches, and the reason for that is that if we've got 3 to 4 inches of loam in an ideal scenario, what we don't want to be doing is working any shallower than that. The reason for that is that it can, if we do have any root breaks, it can destabilise the top of the profile a little bit too much. It can also cause pans if we're consistently working at the same depth every year when we're doing the deep spiking. It can create a compacted layer where the roots actually struggle to develop beyond that. So again, one of the reasons that we want to try and sort of work to a 4-inch depth as an absolute minimum if we can, is to try and get the roots down as deep as we can. That's going to help with any drought tolerance issues in sort of the peak season if we're not able to get as much irrigation on as we'd like. Some of the other pedestrian machines that are really effective are Toro Procore, that some of you might be aware of, or the John Deere Aircore. Both of those machines are pedestrian, and at this time of year particularly, if we are struggling with wet squares, they can be a really good option. Another thing to say is that we don't want to work with a tine that's too big. So normally 14 millimeters is kind of the absolute largest that we really want to use on a cricket square.
Why is that, Julian?
Well, one of the issues that can occur is kind of what we call chipping out of the top of the profile, or pulling the profile up when the tine exits. And it tends to be with the bigger tines because of the forward speed and moving speed of the tractor. So typically 12, 14 mil tines, even pencil tines, if the ground will take it, can be a very good option where deep spiking is concerned. There are some really good tractor mounted deep spikers now that have developed a quicker gearbox. So the really important thing with that means that the tines, when they're working, when the vertical action is punching them in and out, means that they're able to exit the ground at a pretty much a 90-degree angle. The quicker the forward speed and the quicker that we move with a deep spiker, there's a risk of heave, and in an outfield that's quite desirable, where we're actually trying to decompact the surface. But in a cricket square, decompaction is the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. What we're trying to achieve is the pore space and the holes for the root development and for the water penetration. So slow and steady is and a tightly spaced is generally the way to go where aeration is concerned on cricket squares.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you.
Okay, and as I said, with most aerators there is an option to add a degree of heave, but really we want to try and sort of work at 90 degrees, sort of straight in and straight out if we can. The important thing to say is that if we need to understand, and this is kind of the crucial thing with any operation where cricket is concerned, we need to understand what is going on in the engine room. So, you know, a pitch can look fantastic on the top, but actually 80% of what is important where a cricket surface is concerned is what's happening underneath. So if we can take cores out, if we can have a look at our thatch layers, at our root depth, at our loam content, you know, do we have a nice consistent layer of loam, or do we have changes of loams over the years? So that is kind of the driving force behind our decision-making process. You know, what are the issues and what can we look to do to try and address them? If we're having low bounce, it's quite often as a result of root breaks or over-rolling. If we're having inconsistent bounce, or what I'd call tennis ball bounce, it can often be as a result of thatch. If we have dangerous bounce, so stays low, spits up off a length, that can be kind of as a result of loams, of different loams that have been used that haven't bound together properly. So there's almost always a reason behind what we're doing. We can be doing all of the best practice maintenance during the cricket season, but if we're not getting it right at renovation, and we're not able to kind of deal with the issues that we've got there that one time of the year where we're able to sort of really get into it, that's kind of crucial bit. So like I said, November and December time, perfect time to get the deep spiking done. Really critical that it's kind of done in moist but not wet conditions. So we don't want saturated ground, we just want that kind of nice moist pliable surface, because actually we can do quite a bit more harm than good if if we're doing that operation in the wrong conditions. So that's kind of a quick rundown of deep spiking. Have we got any questions before I move on to the minefield that is worms?
I think you've explained that quite well, Julian.
Perfect. Right. Well, I'll move on swiftly to my favourite topic.
Julian, just before you go on, Julian, just one more question. When should you finish deep spiking?
Yeah.
So
really, really good point. Probably December, realistically. I mean, early January would really be the absolute latest, but we've got to allow time for the profile to close up and really seal up those holes by doing sort of that consolidation pre-season. And that's another reason why we don't want to be using tines that are too big as well. So yeah, well done, Keith. You prompted me on an important point there. But yeah, we just don't want to be doing anything that's disturbing the surface too late, really. So November, December time is absolutely ideal. So kind of moving on to worm control. Let's be realistic. The products that have been withdrawn aren't coming back. Brexit or no Brexit, they've been withdrawn for a reason. And we've got to kind of get used to a world and maintaining our grounds in such a way where we have to kind of live with worms to the degree that we can. They're doing an awful lot of good in terms of the amount of recycling of material and eating of organic matter that they do. But there are 3 casting species that causes a problem in terms of our squares and outfields. So the first thing that I would look at is what worms favour in terms of the conditions that they like. So they like moist soils. They like neutral to alkaline soils, so it can be quite helpful to get a bit of an idea of the pH of your squares if you don't know that already, to try and get a simple test to get a bit of an idea of that. If you do have neutral or very alkaline soils, you may be experiencing quite a lot more worm activity. There's a couple of reasons for that. The more alkaline your soils are, the more organic matter you have, and the quicker it builds up. And obviously they like medium textured soils, which is a bit of a nightmare where cricket's concerned, because that's pretty much where we fit with our clay loams. So what can we look at in terms of cultural controls? Boxing off clippings is a major food source. So clippings are a major food source for worms. So the more we can box off clippings and remove those, the better. Fairly important for this time of year, removing any leaf litter or debris that's found its way onto the square. And then there are obviously the fairly standard but often forgotten practices where cricket's concerned. We do have an understandable tendency to be fed up to the back teeth of cricket by the time the end of the season comes. We put the square to bed, we do our end of season renovations, and then we try and forget about it a little bit. I've certainly been guilty of that down the years on my cricket square. Hopefully with a shortened season we're a little bit more enthusiastic than we might sometimes be at this time of year. So brushing of casts, drag matting of casts, harrow raking of casts, and kind of what I mean by that is you might have seen kind of these uni rake devices that sort of flick through the profile. Rotary mowing, if it's a reasonably dry day and we've maybe had a little bit of ground frost the night before to kind of harden the casts up, that can be a really good time just to skim over. It can be a really good time to break the casts up. And the good old combi rake, slightly back breaking work, but if we use that and we don't sort of press down too aggressively as we would in the season when we're doing our preparation, the actual rake implement on that can be really effective to break those casts up. One of the big problems with using brushes and drag mats at this time of year is that they can often smear the casts, and that's kind of really what we want to try and avoid. So it's pretty much a question we're trying to get rid of the worm casts. So really trying to do that when the soil conditions are right. You know, if we get a little bit of a frost and the leaf frost is cleared and the casts are kind of firmed up a little bit, good time to sort of try and clear them away. And a practice that's fairly common in golf, but probably not so much in cricket, is kind of the switching of squares. Now that can be kind of, they do kind of sell specific switching rods that can kind of be used to remove dew and that sort of thing, but actually a kind of cheap bendable fishing rod can be a pretty good tool for doing that. And because of the quick action, it's actually pretty good at dispersing worm casts. So this is the desperation that we've got to with worms now, where we're talking about using fishing rods to shift the casts. But you know, rather than spending a fortune on a proper switching tool, it can be a possibility of using that.
Julian, I know I don't want to interrupt, but merely to say that the grounds advice for Nottinghamshire has been trialling some new worm repellent.
I'm coming on to the controls.
Okay.
So,
sorry, I thought we'd given them up altogether, or by using your dad's fishing rod. And
no, we haven't. We haven't. It's just that we're now probably having to look at a combination of things. So that's the cultural controls. In terms of what we have in our arsenal, in terms of products, the first important point to say, and this is often a point of confusion, you only need a pesticide spraying license if a product has what is called a MAP number, or it is what is characterised as a plant protection product. So most of the products, well, all of the products really that are now available to reduce worm casting, I should say, really, rather than control, are generally usable without a pesticide spraying license. So you still need to be able to understand how to calibrate a sprayer, how to understand the walking speed, how to understand how much water you're putting out, and all of that sort of stuff. But you don't physically need a pesticide spraying license unless you are spraying fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, although they're dwindling, but anything with a MAP number. And that kind of moves me on really to what is available. So most of the products that we've got access to now are what are sort of known as soil acidifiers. There's a range of products on the market that are sold by various companies, and basically what they do is the aim of them is to slowly either acidify the soil profile. So we spoke about kind of that neutral pH and that alkaline pH. So we're slowly reducing the soil pH to a more acidic level where the worms aren't too happy. Some of them contain a small amount of what we call surfactant wetting agent, so that kind of holds the product in the top of the soil profile for a longer period. But the important thing to kind of understand with most of these products now is that they only really work for 2 or 3 weeks. So you may find that in kind of the autumn period, when it's not cold enough to be getting ground frosts and the worms are kind of staying below ground, that actually we're probably maybe having to reapply those every 2 or 3 weeks. And they aren't the cheapest, albeit on a cricket square it's a relatively small area, and they can certainly be worthwhile. But yeah, I mean, anything that is iron sulfate, fertilizers with sulfates in, and even kind of straight sulfur will potentially have an acidifying effect on the soil and reduce the amount of worm casts that you're getting. But what I would say is if you are going to go down that route of using those sort of products on a regular basis, the advice is to have soil analysis done in the autumn and in the spring to make sure that you're not going too far and too quickly in reducing your soil pH, because if we go too far, perennial ryegrasses really aren't very comfortable with a pH that's less than about 5 or maybe 4.5 at a push. So it's quite important to have a look at that. One of the things that I'll touch on briefly is tea seed meal, or what's kind of known as saponins. Some of you might be a bit more familiar with Purity, and I think the Vitax C is another one that's come out recently. These are basically soil conditioners that are not sold as having worm controlling effects, other than their modes of application in terms of they need thoroughly watering in almost straight after application, and some of them recommend that they are applied after deep spiking, tell us that they want to be going into the soil, and they are fairly effective. They aren't recommended for worm control, so I can't kind of recommend that you use them. But I think one of the questions that we had in this evening is kind of how effective are they? Well, one of the county grounds did some research on this, and the kind of acidifying products reduced the worm casting by down to about 40 to 50% of where they were previously. These products are working more around about the 15% mark. So they are very effective. The thing that we don't know is their effects on other worm populations in the soil. And we don't have a huge amount of data on kind of their effects on the soil in general in the long term, because they're you know, in terms of Purity, it's been around for probably sort of 5 years. Vitax product more recent than that. But basically they all have kind of a similar mode of action where worms are concerned, where they're washed in thoroughly. So ideally, if you are going to use them, it's sort of immediately before rainfall. They can sort of be applied with a fertilizer spreader as you would do with fertilizer granules, but yeah, they need to be applied straight before rain or straight before irrigation, very thoroughly watered in, and then basically the effect that they have is that they will irritate the worms and bring them to the surface, at which point the worms either need removing, or they will basically desiccate if they are left on the surface and die. So not the most friendly of products. It's a little bit like genocide for worms, and as I say, they aren't labelled and sold as worm control.
It's called Enhance, Julian.
Yeah, so that's the Vitax product. Again, my understanding is that it's similar to Purity in terms of it's a saponin-based product. But as I say, they are soil conditioners. They do contain a small amount of nitrogen and some biological enhancers that will sort of you probably notice improved turf health after use, but I haven't used them personally, so I can't advocate their use. Yes, Steve.
I'm actually just ordered 3 bags of this, Julian, and I've had disappointments, like I'm sure a lot of our other guys have as well. and I'm actually probably going to do that in the next few days.
Yeah.
I've ordered 3 bags. 3 bags will do 18 pitches.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give it a go. I've used Clearcast, which was, you've got to keep doing it.
Yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what I mean? You've got to keep doing it and doing it and doing it. Well, it's quite costly. So,
Yeah.
I mean, in the book, it says, 10 to 16 weeks on the product, but, I don't think it's been out that long. But the guy, have you heard of Jason Garlick from JMG?
Yeah.
He's quite a good guy.
Yeah.
So he's been doing my outfield for many years. So I'm going to give it a go.
Yeah, I've seen that Jason's been doing quite a lot. I think like I said, he does advertise using the soil conditioners for worm control. The only thing that I'd say, a little bit like carbendazim or any products, is that if they start getting used to death and they start finding their way into the watercourses, it probably won't be too long again before somebody's looking at withdrawing them. But yeah, you bang on with the acidifying product, Steve. It's probably every 14 to 21 days, realistically.
The other thing I would say is that we will have to do a bit more work as well, won't we? The more worms we get. To be fair, I know we're going to have to do it delicately, but I think we're going to have to be a bit more precise to work on the square a little bit. Like you said, just before frost probably, and keep the cast dry.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely trying to get the timing right. Like I said, reducing the food source, end of season renovation is so important. Trying to absolutely minimise that organic matter. Try and get that thatch layer to as little as possible. And like I said, it is worthwhile investigating the acidifiers. The only thing that I would say with clay soils is that they have a buffering effect where pH is concerned, so it actually can be quite a slow process to reduce the soil pH in clay soils. So, but yeah, hopefully that kind of covers off some of the questions that we've had where worms are concerned. Is anybody got any more questions on worms, or are we
move on, Julian? I think you've done very well on that.
Julian,
yeah.
Question for you. Hypothetically speaking, of course, if anyone had got any cast off, is that still a decent product to use, or would it be a safe product to use?
Carbendazim was withdrawn in 2017, so its use now is illegal. It's still being found in watercourses, but if somebody from the Environment Agency by chance was to find it or see it used, basically it is both the club and the individual that are liable to be taken to task over that usage. So yeah, if there is any carbendazim remaining, basically what you should be doing is getting it disposed of by a contracted disposal company. Okay.
Cool.
It's illegal to store it. It's illegal to keep it in your garage. Don't be stupid.
As you say,
Take it home and store it out of the way.
The storage and usage was, I think, September 2017 to dispose of it safely. I think was about another month after that, so they really didn't give people long. But yeah, it's completely illegal to use now.
Okay. Thank you.
But it is still being found in watercourses on a regular basis by the water companies. Ironically, quite often next to golf courses. Perhaps not that surprising, but there we go. So yeah, I'll kind of move on swiftly onto diseases. Basically, we look at diseases that are kind of caused by over fertilization or what we call low fertility. So this time of year, I think probably one that we're maybe going to see or have seen quite a bit of um, is red thread. Like most diseases that we see at this time of year, it's caused by humidity and moisture. One of the things that I love to see is an early ground frost, because it tends to do away with a lot of the leaf-borne diseases like leaf spot, red thread, any sort of Fusarium, mycelium, or anything like that. But the thing with red thread to say, and I think I've probably said this before at previous meetings that we've had, is it's basically a result of low fertility. It can cause thinning of the sward. It's unlikely to decimate your grass sward in the same way that a Fusarium might do, or a very bad case of anthracnose or something like that, but it really is relatively avoidable. The reason why we tend to see it after spells of heavy rain is basically that rain is washing the nutrients out of the soil. When we get in heavy rainfall at this time of year, it tends to be when we maybe got slightly milder weather, so when it's 13, 14 degrees. And that's kind of where we sort of get these real outbursts of kind of red pink grass leaves that basically then tend to sort of die off and look a bit pale and a bit yellow. But as I've said before, and I'll touch on fertilizers in a moment, cricket squares are wonderful things because they're relatively small. If we think about the amount of money that our club are spending on cricket balls, training equipment, match kits, you name it, spending a couple of £100 a year on a decent fertilizer program, and that's probably an absolute maximum, is really worth its weight in gold. We don't want to be encouraging a lush, very rapid growing green sward where cricket is concerned. We want to slow release, fairly low nitrogen products, but if we keep that level of nutrition fairly consistent throughout the season, we'll really keep at bay a lot of those low nutrition diseases that we see. Fusarium patch is another one. I wouldn't expect to see too much of this in cricket squares. We're generally dealing with fairly ryegrass dominant swards. Fusarium patch is particularly bad on annual meadow grass. Golf courses tend to suffer quite badly with it if they've got annual meadow grass greens. But basically it starts off as kind of a dark water soaked patch, and then it develops into kind of a salmon pinky orange patch, and that is incredibly nasty. If you get bad bouts of that, that can really sort of clear out a sward. Thankfully, again, it's not something that we suffer too much of in cricket, but there are two ways it develops. You kind of get an active disease and a passive disease. So an active disease is one where you kind of get this sort of white mold in the middle of the orange patch, and that means that the disease is active. One of the things to say, it's incredibly easily spread on equipment and machinery, you name it. So if we can at all, we either need to kind of try and get somebody to spray for it, but again, the amount of what I call contact fungicides that can deal with the disease once it's already an outbreak of it are fairly limited now. So really, if we do start to see it at all, it is regular brushing, removal of dew, trying to keep the square as dry as we possibly can until the conditions have past where it's not likely to proliferate. So when the temperatures get a little bit cooler, I don't know if anybody on here has kind of experienced Fusarium Patch before. Hopefully not. Like I said, it is relatively rare in cricket squares. We do see a little bit of it on ball screens, but it is generally golf that tends to suffer with it the most. And that kind of brings me on fairly nicely onto fertilizers. Grass basically needs a basic level of nutrients to survive. When we collect grass clippings, we're taking off a third of the nitrogen. So it's quite important to try and reintroduce some of the key nutrients into our cricket squares. The time of year really kind of dictates this. So growing season, we want to be looking at, nitrogen levels. Again, we don't want to be encouraging a really fast growing lush plant with cricket because we don't want a lot of top growth. So as I think I've emphasised previously, controlled release fertilisers that are going to give you 3 months as a minimum slow release nutrition are really what we should be looking at. It's not unusual to pay £35-40 a bag, but a cheap bag of fertiliser, if you look at it this way, a cheap bag of fertiliser that's costing you 15 quid is probably giving you 3 weeks of nutrient release. You put it on, it gives you a real whack of and colour, and then after 3 weeks it's done with, it drops off, the colour drops like a stone. Control release fertilisers, in that sense, are very good value. If you look at them based on a weekly basis, they're kind of 50% cheaper than a 15 quid bag in the amount of time and the duration you get out of them. So there are lots of good options where control release fertilizers are concerned. You can get ones that are in a dust form or a mini granule, so they're very, very small and they're going to produce very minimal disruption to the cricket surface. But I'd probably say, back end of March, start of April, look at a spring summer analysis, control release fertilizer, put that on then, well before your play starts. Make sure that there's nothing left on the surface by the time the play comes around. But look to put that on. We need nitrogen in greater quantities kind of in that time of season, so you'll generally kind of get something that's slightly higher in nitrogen where it's concerned. But again, we've got to remember, on a slow release bag of fertilizer or a control release bag of fertilizer, the release is over a much slower period of time. So even if we're getting a product that kind of says 24-0-15, that means 24 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare being released over a 3-month period. So don't need to be worried that it's going to sort of massively encourage a flush of growth. Phosphorus, which is the the second number on a bag of fertilizer, that's really what we want to be looking at in renovation time. That is what helps the new shoots and root development. So probably we'd expect sort of a relatively low number where phosphorus is concerned if we're applying it this time of year. But often if you're looking at preceding fertilizers, they'll have a high phosphorus number. And the absolute critical one at this time of year is potassium. If somebody was saying to me, I haven't done much for renovation, what should I be looking to do now? I would say deep spike and a high potassium control release fertilizer would be the two things. It maximizes root growth, it thickens the cell walls of the grass plant, so it makes it more tolerant to stresses at this time of year like frost. So that's really what we want to be looking for. There are other kind of what we call trace nutrients, like calcium's a very good one for improving nutrient availability in the soil. Iron's very good for hardening turf at this time of year. But we just want to make sure that the square is kind of well established before we use any iron, because high amounts of iron that are applied to juvenile grass plants, it can put them under a lot of stress and kill them in the worst case scenario. So we want to be kind of happy that, that there's a good kind of 6 to 8 since we've renovated before we use anything that's too high in iron. But like I said, a nice control release fertilizer in the spring, another one potentially, or maybe a liquid fertilizer during the playing season if we're sort of comfortable applying that. And then another one really this time of year in the autumn, October time, you know, a really good quality 3 to 6 month autumn control release fertilizer. All you need for a cricket square is a couple of bags. You know, that's what you're talking about. We're talking about, you know, 70 quid or thereabouts to get a good quality control release on, and that's going to keep your plant happy through the autumn and winter months, and keep any disease at bay. But like I said, this time of year, low nitrogen, high potassium, something like a 15-0-28 would be a fairly typical autumn analysis on a control release bag. So that kind of draws the four points to a close. So we've got any questions where fertilizer is concerned?
Julian?
Yeah.
We had a couple of questions asked me last year when the grass started to turn yellow, you know, the new grass that we've got come through.
Yeah.
What would your advice be for grasses turning slightly yellow?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a natural process actually. When we kind of hit the second, third leaf stage as the grass plants matures, we do see some dieback. If we do have annual meadow grass in our cricket squares, that at this time of year will start to shed a lot of leaves and die back because it doesn't like the cooler temperatures. Again, as long as we've got reasonably fertile soil, you're giving it the best opportunity to support the grass plant. Again, if it's following periods of very heavy rainfall, you know, that is really the time when we're expecting to maybe see a drop off in turf colour as kind of the nutrients are washed through. A lot of it's going to depend on whether we put fertiliser down when we've done our end of season renovations, or whether we've relied on a lot of the grass seeds now are kind of coated in the necessary to kind of get them going. And that can be where kind of another application of fertiliser now can be quite beneficial. But you know, you guys have been doing it for long enough where you can keep an eye on the squares. If you start to see yellowing turf, then you know that, you know, basically the grass plant's telling you that it's hungry. So, you know, be led by that to a degree as well.
Yeah, Julian, I've got a quick question for you about the fertilizer. You said that, you know, like for example, the autumn one, 15-0-28.
Yeah.
The standard one, I'm not criticising Talbot Turf, but the standard one we get from Talbot Turf is 468, and I suspect, I don't know, 80% of groundsmen in Derbyshire use 468 in autumn. Are you saying we should all be asking for Talbot Turf to provide, for example, 15-0-28 and the very high nitrogen slow release ones for the summer?
The only thing that 468 would indicate to me is that for one, it's probably straight release, because it's quite low numbers in terms of the product. So it's probably 4 to 6 weeks that you're getting out of that. That phosphorus number at this time of year, so that is almost a fertilizer that is ideally probably for almost 2 weeks after you've done your renovation. You've got some phosphorus in there that's kind of supporting new growth and the nutrient development. The only caveat to that is I'm assuming it doesn't have any iron in it, but you wouldn't want to use that if straight after seeding if it did. So a 468, yeah, high in phosphorus, high in potassium. Potassium great, phosphorus not really needed at this time of year. And like I said, it kind of depends on the release of the nutrients. So yeah, I mean, ideally, I'd be encouraging yourselves to sort of have a conversation and say, can we be looking at a control release product that's going to give us, 3-4 months, and yeah, it's probably going to cost us more money, but it's potentially a more suitable product. The 468 is probably absolutely perfect if it's going on, quite soon after renovations, but typically now we'd be sort of getting into the 6 to 8 weeks after renovations window. I know the seasons went on a little bit later this year and renovations were done a little bit later, but yeah, we just want to try and have something at the end of the year to take us through that winter period. Okay. Right, so that leads me on to these lovely questions that have been submitted. So the first one was, my contractor let me down this year and the end of season pitch work hasn't been done yet. Is it too late to start next week, or will I do more harm than good? Your answer is it is too late. I'm afraid. Where scarification and loam is concerned, that is going to be a no-no now. The ground's going to be too wet. There's going to be too much moisture. You're not going to do a clean job. There's a possibility that you can still consider doing some overseeding, but it's a bit of a toss of a coin at this time of year. We could have quite a mild month, and you might see some germination and you might see some establishment, or in 2 weeks' time we could get a week of hard frost and it's 2 bags of grass seed up the Swanee. The other thing I should say is that if you are going to consider seeding this late and you haven't done autumn scarification, you need to have a bit of an idea what your thatch layers are, because again, it's a waste of time seeding into the thatch layer. Also, realistically, in terms of getting seed and soil contact, you're probably going to have to look at using a dimple seeder if you're going to do seeding now, because otherwise you're not going to get that grass seed into the top of the profile where it needs to be. If you think what we're normally doing with seeding operations, we're doing the seeding, we're applying loam on top, and that gives it the seed bed and the protection to germinate. What I would say is that when we get into the spring, the earlier we can start to verticut, rake, brush on those squares that haven't been renovated, the better. Again, trying to minimise that organic matter as much as possible. We don't want to be disturbing the surface too much, because we don't want to be kind of be breaking up the layer of soil only maybe sort of a month, 6 weeks away from play. But the more that we can do to keep that profile clean in the top, the better. Again, definitely worth considering doing deep spiking if you've not been able to do an end of season renovation. The deep spiking and the fertilisation that I've mentioned are still really valid operations, even if you've not been able to do your renovations as normal. But yeah, in terms of doing scarification and a full end of season renovation, it's too late, I'm afraid. I don't know if whoever asked the question wants to come back on that or wants to comment anymore, but hopefully that's given you a bit of clarity. The next question was, I get red thread on my pitch in the summer. I know one solution is to feed with high nitrogen fertilizer, but it's expensive, and does red thread do any damage if I ignore it? I think I've covered that already, so unless anybody wants to shout up and ask for any more detail on that, I think I've kind of covered that. Not necessarily high nitrogen, but just enough to keep the grass plant ticking over would be the message from me. And again, that's kind of having an understanding of where our square is at, and having soil analysis done. Soil analysis on a cricket square, 30 quid. a year to have a bit of an idea of where your nutrients are at, and that's going to allow you to sort of make informed decisions, which is what we want to be doing. The next question was, I get clover on my pitch and have tried the standard herbicides but can't get rid of it, and each year the patches seem to get a bit bigger. Is there anything more I can do? So we look at what clover likes. Clover likes close mown turf, so bad news for us because that's what we have to do on cricket squares. But what it does like is low fertility, so comes back to adequate nutrition. So doing that, reducing the competition, so as dense a grass sward as we can keep. And the herbicide one is an interesting point. What we need to be looking at is the clover covered by the herbicides that I've tried? So is it on the product label and is it covered? Most broad spectrum selective herbicides will treat clover fairly effectively in my experience. So the thing that would sort of lead me on from that is, has it gone on at the right dose rate? Have we applied it with enough water? What conditions was it applied in? If it's been applied in drought conditions, that could have an effect on how effectively the herbicide is taken up by the weed. Potentially try on with a little bit of liquid fertilizer. That can be quite effective where weed control is concerned. It helps the weeds to take up the herbicide a little bit better. And you can look at a herbicide that's described as a broad spectrum selective herbicide, but one that is translocated. That means that it's taken in by the leaf, but also the roots of the weed. The one thing to say with clover is the clover seeds can stay in the ground for a heck of a long time and survive drought, frost, you name it. So if you do have a clover problem, you probably are going to have to reapply herbicides on an annual basis to kind of keep it at bay. But again, the surface grooming, the verticutting, the raking, anything that we can do to kind of reduce the population in cultural methods will help with that as well. So hopefully that answers that question. Is purity good for worm control? I think we've covered purity. We've covered the saponin based products. So
move on from worm control, Julian.
We can move on from that. So the final sort of pre-submitted question was, I want to add a new pitch to my square. This was a really interesting one. I want to add a new pitch to my square. We're a small club who play in lower divisions. What is the minimum depth of pitch that I need? They've kind of said that 4 tons of loam for every inch depth means that the new pitch is expensive for us. First thing to say, stripping and introducing new material into even one pitch is expensive. There's no getting around that. If we were doing it to ECB specification and it was being done at a county ground, the recommendation is 4 inches of depth, and we also have to consider what the subsoil is like underneath. So if you were unfortunate enough to have quite a sandy, loamy soil on your outfield, or quite a coarse soil underneath that loam, you might actually also be looking at having to put in a couple of inches of more appropriate subsoil as well. So that would further add to the cost. The easiest way of kind of determining that is to have a particle soil distribution analysis done. So basically that will tell you what the composition of your indigenous soil is. So I was chatting about this to a colleague earlier, and he used to work for many years at Essex County Cricket Club, and he was saying they were quite fortunate that they had indigenous, well, probably unfortunate in some ways from a drainage perspective in their outfield, but where they were trying to add another pitch in, they had indigenous clay soils that were actually between 30 and 35% clay, which is pretty much where we want to be in terms of a cricket loam. So he almost had a cricket loam indigenous soil. So that actually meant that they were able to add an extra pitch on with only a couple of inches of cricket loam introduced into the surface. But there isn't an easy answer to this question because it's very much site specific. However, the standard kind of methodology is strip off the topsoil, so try and look at the depth to which we need to do it. The recommended quantities are actually a little bit less than had been said, so they kind of reckon 4 tons of loam for every inch. Actually, the ECB guidance recommends about 2.5 cubic meters per inch, so that actually equates to about 2,500 kilograms per inch, so about 2.5 tons. So if we're looking at, I don't know, an average bag of loam delivered, if we call it a fiver, we'd probably be talking about 600 quid of materials for every inch that we need to add. Absolutely critical thing with a new pitch construction is consolidation of the layers at every 2 inches of material. So if we so for argument's sake, if we were to strip out to 4 inches, we need to grade that subsoil and make sure that it's within a tolerance of plus or minus 3 millimeters when we start. But then we also need to do what we call a keying in process. So we rake up that subsoil normally with a powered rake, and then we add the first 2 inches of new loam material on top. We then look to use boards or again laser levels to level that off. But the first 2 inches would then have to be what we call healed in. Incredibly time consuming, but absolutely essential to squeeze down and consolidate that new loam as much as we possibly can. Contractors will often use caterpillar tracks on a machine, something called a sheep's foot roller, whacker plates, you name it. But kind of the old school methodology is to kind of heel it in. Once that is done, we then rake again, and we then add the next 2 inches of material. We do exactly the same process with the consolidation. And then we would laser grade or use boards and string to final levels, and again within a plus or minus 3 millimeter tolerance. My recommendation, it's quite technical work, it's quite you have to have good knowledge to do it. However, I appreciate in the lower levels, some people I've heard of have used a turf cutter, removed the material and done it that way. But it is pretty specialised, and unfortunately it's not a cheap operation to do that.
How much, Julian? How much do you reckon for one pitch?
Well,
if there's nothing untoward happens, you just put in how much do you reckon?
If we're doing it if somebody was saying to me, what would you recommend, and I was following ECB specification down to 4 inches, you probably wouldn't get much change from about £8,000 to £10,000 if you were getting a contractor to do it for you.
So and it's virtually impossible to do yourself without hiring heavy machinery, isn't it?
It's pretty, you got to have you've really got to back your skills and have a decent level of expertise, and like I said, that consolidation of each layer is the most critical thing, as well as the finishing levels, because we will get a certain degree of settlement in any new pit. The more compaction and consolidation we do of those 2 inch layers, the less settlement we'll get, essentially. So
but there's not much chance of him doing it then, is there? Julie, have you anything to add on this? I mean, because your firm does a lot, don't they?
Don't be right. Our landscaping side of the company has actually done cricket pitches, from new, So, you know, they're big guys to ask. I won't be able to give you a price on that. I haven't got a clue off the top of my head because it's different division to what I work in. So, but they're very approachable.
You did Duffield, didn't you? I believe. Your lot did Duffield.
I think we did do some work for Duffield. I think we've done some work at West Hallam, but I think we've done it over the country, not just locally in Derbyshire. So, and like I said, I don't really get involved with them. I try not to if I can help it. So I have enough on my side.
Cheers, Julie. Thank you. Sorry, Julian. I was just
no problem at all. I mean, obviously, if you're having a whole square,
we haven't got 10,000 quid, so we're not going to extend our squares.
I mean, if you're having a whole square done from scratch, you know, a 12 pitch square, it'd probably be 70,000 quid. But obviously, because you're doing such a big area, the cost per wicket is. So yeah, not a cheap job to do. If you're looking to do something that's going to allow you to play more cricket, then as much as it pains me to say, it's probably not a bad idea to look at a decent artificial pitch, which should be about 5,000 quid, I think. To maybe facilitate training or more junior cricket, as much as.
Thank you. Yeah, good answer.
Swear word for me, but there we go. So that kind of draws to a close. I'm sorry we ran over a little bit. I'm happy to take any questions that anybody's got. There's no such thing as a daft question, really. We do these events to help you guys out as much as possible. So if you've got any site-specific stuff, then please fire away.
Yeah, can I just ask you? My square is down at Cromford. It was laid 156 years ago.
Yeah.
And the depth of grass is only, the depth of the soil, sorry, before it hits shale is only 8 or 9 inches. It's obviously it's nowhere near what you would expect for a test wicket, but is it not deep enough? I mean, we can't afford to change it, but
no, I mean 8 or 9 inches is absolutely fine. I mean, really. It may have an impact on drainage capacity down to that depth, depending on the material underneath. But in terms of any effect on playability, really the top 4 inches is what we're worried about from a cricket perspective. You know, as good and as dense a root structure as we can develop is key. This is what I said about trying to understand through taking cores what's going on in the engine room. You know, in recent years, we've seen these deep drilling operations increasingly used in cricket, and the reason why they are so good is because they can kind of be done as soon as the season finishes, even when the ground is quite hard. Yeah. And they can be, again, it can be costly, but what can be really good with those is that we can then brush brand new loam into the holes. And use that to kind of improve the percentage of desirable cricket loam in a profile. It's a bit of a shame that Andy Butler's not on tonight, because I know that he's had that done at Repton School on most years recently. But
Julian
had it done, didn't they?
Julian, there's been 2 clubs in the Derbyshire County area that's had it done in the last 2 years.
Oh, brilliant!
Darleydale.
Yeah,
it might be worth a call to Darleydale to see how they've gone on. Mm-hmm. And also Ilkeston Cricket Club. They've had it done instead of having a new square.
Yeah.
I gave them a few options, and they went for the deep coring and then filling in the holes. And the idea of that is to build a good base.
That's right.
Around the soil that they've already got. And then a continuation, then a deep spike in, adding more loam. The same loam, by the way, the same. It's got to be the same. But I'm hoping in 2 years' time we get a report back off those 2 clubs. And, I said I might nip over and just have a look at a game or something like that, see how it's going. But I do know those two clubs have had it done.
Quite often, I know Darleydale quite well. Obviously, being close to us, they had a very, very low bounce on their wicket at one stage. So hopefully, that works out for them.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, low bounce is often caused by root breaks, which can be which can be addressed through deep spiking and trying to pin the profile through root structure. But yeah, I mean the deep drilling is really good because we can introduce a really good amount of material into the profile, and some really good quality consistent loam as well. And that's the thing really. If we're when people come to me and say, I'm looking to change loams, my first question is why? What do you think that you're going to achieve by doing that? There are lots of other practices that we can do that are going to improve the pace, bounce, consistency of the pitch first before we start even looking at using a higher clay content loam. What are our practices in terms of drying out a wicket? Are we using covers to slow the drying out process? How are we managing it? But it all starts with a good renovation really, and taking soil cores and understanding what's going on underneath.
Thank you.
Julian, hi, it's John Worthy from Pursley and Clay Cross.
Hi, John.
You've actually answered the questions that I submitted earlier, which was what are the two things that somebody new to looking after their own ground could do?
Yeah.
You've talked mainly about the square, almost exclusively about the square. What about the outfield? Is there anything that we should be doing there?
The reason why I don't concentrate on the outfield too much in where we're talking about grassroots cricket is generally financial. It's such a big area that unless we're potentially talking about Premier League clubs that might be in the position to we control our outfields or have them deep spiked or do some of those works to them. In terms of the outfield, the main thing really is to make sure that we're mowing consistently in the right conditions. There's a tendency as well to mistakenly believe that shorter means quicker ball roll, etc., etc. Not necessarily the case. I think any shorter than 12 millimeters for an outfield is too short. It's really about trying to manage the grass in such a way that when we're in drought conditions, we're not mowing it any shorter than we need to, making sure that it's being mown in the right conditions, trying to do that when the grass leaf is dry if possible, but equally trying not to do it in the peak heat of the day. I appreciate for volunteers we can't always do things when we'd ideally like, but the mowing equipment's really important, making sure that blades are sharp and correctly set before use. But yeah, I mean outfields wise, yes, we control in an ideal scenario. Yes, deep spiking, vertidraining, whatever you want to call it, is fantastic to do if we can do it. And ultimately, if we can do something like disc seeding of an outfield to improve the percentage of perennial ryegrass that we've got in an outfield, then that's absolutely fantastic. Probably more achievable if any of you share with junior football, for example. If any of you have affiliated junior football on your outfields, there's a lot of funding available to support football clubs at the moment, which is another area of my work with the FA. But there is the ECB interest-free loan scheme, and hopefully some of the work that we've been doing to try and gauge the success of the return to cricket grants and the support that's required will lead the ECB as time goes on to sort of look at more direct investment into the grass side of grounds. That's what I'm working towards at the moment. Any of you that are involved at Premier League will have probably picked up emails from me recently.
Cheers.